Okay, I'm out here now on February 7th, I think. Somewhere around now. We're still middle of the winter here in eastern Oregon. You can probably see some of these shots. Snows are laying heavy in the high country. Temperature's pretty good for bike riding, though, for February down here in the valley. One thing I want to talk about today is wildfire national forest lands. A few decades past, Forest Service determined there were 4 major threats to our national forests. One was wildfire, 2 was invasive species, 3 was development. Although there's not much development allowed on national forest land. That one perplexes me, to say the least. Then the last one is unmanaged recreation, of all things. Today I just want to talk about the first one, wildfire threat. Every year in this country, nearly 7 million acres of national forest land go up in smoke. That's an average number of acres, 7 million acres average each year. Those statistics come from 2000 to 2006. During that same period, fire suppression costs were a little over $1 billion to the taxpayers. Coincidentally, Forest Service says for that same amount of money, they could have treated those same number of acres for about $170 an acre. Now, why is that? Why is so many acres going up in smoke every year at such a high cost? Well, let's start with some history. Forest Service started suppressing fires back in the early 1900s. There was one fire in particular called the Fire of 1910. That fire was a very large fire in Idaho and Montana. People lost their lives, property was destroyed. In fact, they say that it generated so much energy that huge trees were uprooted and tossed several hundred yards through the air. After that fire, the Forest Service decided they'd have a policy of 100% fire suppression, meaning that every fire, all 100% of fire starts would be suppressed 100% of the time. Well, that worked for a while. Then in the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, the large fires started returning. Started out with 1,000 acre, 2,000, 5,000 acre fires, and now today we have fires somewhere in this country almost every year of 100,000 acres or more for just one fire. So the Forest Service decided it would revise that 100% fire suppression policy and implement what's known as let it burn. They would gradually reintroduce fire back into the ecosystem and use it as a tool to consume the heavy fumes that have built up over all those years of 100% fire suppression. And that worked sometimes. Sometimes caused us bigger problems than what they already had. Generally speaking, if a lightning caused a fire within a designated wilderness area, if conditions are right, location, weather, etc., that they let it burn. One particular fire in those mountains right there, it's called the Sloan Ridge Fire. That fire started during a low pressure system passed through eastern Oregon, and I believe it was sometime in July. Anyhow, the fire weather pattern for that summer had been these heat lows, they call them, coming up out of California. And up until that low pressure system, temperatures in eastern Oregon were well above 90, very close to 100 many times. Then that low pressure system came through, temperature dropped probably I think down into the 40s at night at least. And for about 3 days it was foggy and drizzly. That's one little lightning strike hit Sloan's Ridge, and the fire smoldered for 3 days. You can see it from the Elkhorn Loop, Highway 73. Now the Forest Service decided they'd let that fire burn because the weather was right. It was inside the wilderness area, designated wilderness area. When I heard that, I just about croaked. You see, I know a little bit about wildfire fighting. I worked for the Forest Service most all my life. 3 years running a fire engine. With that summer-long heat low pattern that we were experiencing, that was absolutely not the right time to let that fire burn. After 3 days of smoldering, a heat low, just like I guessed, rolled back into eastern Oregon. Temperatures shot up close to 100. That fire blew up, took out several thousand acres and almost the entire wilderness area. So clearly, they had a lot to learn about let it burn. So what other reasons could there be besides mismanagement of the fire suppression and all that? Well, let's talk about timber harvest for a minute. Forest Service had a policy in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s of logging as much timber as they could. People called it get out the cut. One forest supervisor actually said he had a plan to get more board feet off of Lyle Whitman than it had ever been cut before. He fulfilled that promise, and in the process put the timber industry in eastern Oregon out of business for lack of timber to cut. The guy did not know the meaning of sustainable logging practices. To this day, there are very few timber jobs in this county. There are no mills left in Baker County at all. There's one in LeGrand, Boise Cascade Mill. And the last small mill, I think over in Prairie City, and I kind of think it's been shut down recently too. So after they cleared all the big timber, that allowed another species, a very low value tree at the time and still is today, called the grand fir tree. Grand fir has little market value, grows like a weed, it's highly susceptible to fire, burns like gasoline. All the trees they cut down during the logging days, ponderosa pine, western larch, they were highly resistant to wildfire and actually acted like a fire break, keeping the fire on the ground, keeping it at low heat signatures, and actually created a fire situation that was easily managed. Now, with decades of grand fir growing up everywhere, the forest is getting heavily loaded with fuels, both live and dead. These live fuels, the grand fir, like I said, burn like gasoline. And are contributing 100% to these large devastating fires. Well, Whitman ain't the only forest that has this issue. Every forester in the West does. there's one more issue. And this one really pisses me off. Environmentalists. Back in the 80s and 90s, the environmentalists started out by doing some good things. Suing the Forest Service, trying to get them to realize what sustainable yield in their timber practices meant. Yeah, unfortunately, environmentalists got awful good at suing the Forest Service. They won a lot of lawsuits, shut down a lot of timber sales. Back then, it's probably a good thing. Unfortunately, environmentalists never grew up. He never pulled on his big boy pants. Forest Service learned from their mistakes, and today almost every timber treatment project, at least on the Lyle Whitman, and I'm pretty sure all over the West, is designed to reduce heavy fuel buildup and large forest fires, as well as the enhancement of wildlife habitat and the restoration of our national forest ecosystems. But guess what? Today the Forest Service, guess what? The environmentalists today continues to sue the Forest Service. Stop each and every project they can. For example, Lyle Whitman, the Whitman Ranger District, had a project called Snow Basin. Snow Basin project covered about 30,000 acres. Environmentalists sued and shut it down. Why did they sue? Because in the Snow Basin treatment plan, there were some 600 and some acres identified for the cutting of what the environmentalist calls old growth trees. That's trees 21 inches or over. Now there is a rule, you're not supposed to do that, but that rule is not set in stone. Trees in that 600 and some acres out of 30,000 that the Forest Service wanted to cut were, guess what? Grand fir, no market value, contribute highly to the fuel buildup and large devastating forest fires. That's a known fact, don't let them tell you any different. And yes, there was some other species they wanted to cut, but only if they were diseased, insects or disease. Now, the environmentalists claim, it's a local operation here in the Hells Canyon area, they claim Forest Service is going to cut over 40,000 trees on that Snow Basin project, old growth trees over 21 inches. I find it very difficult to believe there's 40,000 trees of old growth 21 inches or bigger on some 600 acres. I know, I've been in this forest all my life. A big tree is far and few between. You can find out all this and verify these facts on the internet. So anyhow, I'm going to stop jabbering about that for now and give you a look at the Eagle Mountains. It's the south part of the Lyle Mountains. And that's where the Snow Basin project is located. Can you imagine that entire mountain range burnt black? If our local environmentalist organization has their way, that's what they'll get.